Hi everyone, I hope you are all doing well. In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about infant and toddler play. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone that I sent out a few announcements this week regarding some updates on the syllabus, so please make sure to look at the new due dates for everything, and you'll see that they've been extended to allow you a little bit of extra time. And I will be posting this week the assignment guidelines video regarding the child observation report. So you'll see that reflected on Sunday along with your later childhood lecture. For this week, I'm going to be posting this lecture, the infant and toddler one, and then your preschool one. So stay tuned for additional information, and I'll send out announcements at the end of the week if anything changes. Okay, so let's jump right in. We're going to start by talking about play versus exploration. We've previously discussed different notions of play, such as play is non-literal, play is created by the children, and we've also talked about different forms and types of play, and we're going to be exploring how those different types of play and notions of play look across different age groups, starting with infants and toddlers. So let's first discuss play versus exploration. How do infants and toddlers play, and how do infants and toddlers explore, and what's the difference? What does that look like? And your text describes the two concepts based on what do objects do as your exploration and what can I do with objects as your play. So basically exploration is the precursor to play. It's the beginnings of, and play comes post exploration. So we start out with exploring objects, discovering the physical properties of objects, and the way that we might be interacting with objects is more neutral and mildly negative in our social experience. So we're focused on a task in a neutral type of reaction where I might just be reaching for a ball and I'm continuing to reach for it. And the mildly negative social experience might be that I'm focused on this task and I'm interested, but there's a level of uncertainty. I've never reached for a ball before because I'm starting out as my first form of exploration with a ball and with reaching, thinking back to the sensorimotory abilities. So children behave in stereotypical ways when they're exploring in their world. So they're not using objects yet with a creative idea of what they would like to do. They're simply shaking, sucking, reaching, grasping. They're using their sensory motor abilities to drive their exploration of objects and with objects. And children in the exploration stage are totally devoted to the object of exploration. So they're intensely studying the object and figuring out how the object works and really just exploring the physical properties of the object at hand. And then once children move over to play, we can think of the idea of play as what can I now do with the objects? And now that I'm in play, this is where it's created by the children. So we're having joyful, highly positive emotional experiences during play. So children now have an understanding of how objects work, what their functions are, and they can enjoy the process of using the object. So now that they have practiced reaching for the ball, they can understand that they might roll the ball to an adult and the adult will roll the ball back, and they engage in this form of back and forth interactions with another person or start to bounce the ball, and they're more relaxed and flexible, so they're comfortable in their movements and their abilities to engage with objects during play. This also goes for varying heart rates, and concentration might be less intense. So when I'm exploring an object that is new and I have uncertainty around this object, I might be extremely focused and tedious, intensely studying that object, whereas now that I am playing with it, I'm more carefree and I'm not as structured or rigid, and I'm not studying it as much anymore and trying to figure it out. I'm thinking, oh, okay, now that I know what it can do, how am I going to use it? What else can I do with it? So that's where play versus exploration comes into play. And we can also think about when we're talking today, I want you to think about your role and reflect on your role in supporting infants and toddlers during their play, in the types of materials that we provide to them and the types of strategies that we implement to support developmental growth. This is our indirect and our direct guidance that we're providing towards children, and just thinking about how am I responding to cues. Am I creating an environment that is supporting brain development? And we're going to talk later about the effects of trauma and areas on the brain that impact brain development later on, but just kind of thinking about how your role, and we discussed earlier, thinking of children's zone of proximal development and the importance of paying attention to where is the child currently at in their abilities and their learning, and what do I need to do in order to support them. So just some forward thinking, food for thought as we're discussing today. Okay, so now let's dive into infant and toddler physical play. We already know the importance of physical play, and now we're going to discuss what that looks like for the infant or toddler. And we see that there are rapid changes in infants and toddlers' physical development. They're growing from top to bottom, and their height, their weight, their strengths and reflex abilities are all increasing rapidly. And they're developing more coordination and control over their head and torso movements. They have increased abilities to grasp tightly onto objects, and this leads to their abilities to engage in manipulative play. So manipulative play is the first stage of physical play, and we see this start to happen at 1 month, 1 to 4 months, and children are watching and practicing body actions. So you might think of if you put an infant in front of a mirror or start to play peekaboo, and how they are mimicking or imitating your actions, and they're looking in the mirror at their actions, or they might mimic the actions of an object that you put in front of them, and they start to grasp onto objects, and they first explore, as we discussed earlier, and then they start to play with the objects. So once they've mastered the exploration and figured out, okay, I understand what this object does and how I use it, now I can figure out what I can do with it. Now that I understand its properties, I can move past mouthing or looking at objects, and I can start to play with them. And when we look at children 4 to 12 months, we want to keep in mind that it's important for them to be able to bring their hands to the midline. So imagine you're holding your two fists over one another, overlapping, and holding them in the center of where your chest is. And imagine you pull a string from where your feet are all the way through the center of where you're holding your arms up to the top of your head. That's our midline, right in the center of our bodies, at our core. And we'll think about how children explore from midline of objects, so the center of the body, moving back and forth from left to right, being able to use both hands independently, so starting off with grasping with both hands and then being able to grasp with one and then the other. And then we look at children's physical play at 12 months, and they're trying out different actions with their toys. So this could be pushing or pulling or banging two blocks together, and we see as children increase in their development, they are moving past first steps of exploring. So they might have started out with pushing and pulling and banging two blocks together, and now they might be moving, okay, I know how the blocks work, so maybe then they start to create sounds later on, and we're going to get into object play and what that looks like in more detail. So now we're going to think about how children use objects and play with objects. Now that we have an understanding of how children explore and what manipulative play looks like at different ages, we're thinking about object play from a sensorimotor development perspective. So Piaget, he has his cognitive stages of development, and the way that he describes object play for infants and toddlers is one of his sub-stages of cognitive development and play. So we're looking at the physical abilities that children have, exploring with their senses, being active learners, engaged. So this first one is exercise of reflexes. So from birth to 1 month, children are exercising their reflexes, and as you can see here in the circular excuse me, in the circular reactions, we have the primary circular reactions, secondary circular reactions, and tertiary. So it's just 1, 2, and 3. And those first primary circular reactions start with exercising reflexes and then moving on to sucking or feeding for comfort. So our primary circular reactions are what we do to adapt our reflexes to the environment. And this is from about 1 to 4 months. So again, like I said, sucking for feeding or sucking on our thumb for comfort. So the infant or toddler, now that they understand how to use their reflexes, so being able to bring their thumb to their mouth and use their mouth and tongue to suck and close and open, they're now using that sucking motion for feeding and when they need comfort, again, adapting their reflexes to their environment. And then as they move on to secondary circular reactions, we see that baby at 4 to 8 months is starting to repeat actions and they're gaining experience with the results and responses from an adult. So this is where we might see peekaboo come into play, or dropping the ball or cup and waiting for a reaction from the adult, or waiting for the reaction from the object. So maybe the sound that the object makes, or when they're shaking their rattle, what's the sound that it makes, and then they stop and realize, ooh, the sound is gone, and then they start to shake it again. So again, repetitive motions using those initial reflexes and grasping motions or reaching motions, but gaining a reaction or a response. And then we move on to the coordination of secondary circular reactions. So still in that secondary period, but this is about 8 to 12 months, and we see that now infants and toddlers, or infants, they're starting to coordinate their behaviors and they're engaging in more goal-directed behaviors. So they might reach for a hidden object, and we see that object permanence is starting to become more present. Again, the beginning stages of object or symbolic play, which we're going to get into a bit later. So that's what we see as the final stage of the secondary circular reaction. So they're able to coordinate their movements more. So I'm not just reaching for a random object in my sight. I know that you hid my rattle underneath the blanket, and now I'm going to reach for the hidden object, or you put that rattle behind your back and I'm going to go and grab for that. And then the third one, and the tertiary movement circular reactions, I'm going to pause and talk about in just a moment. Okay, my apologies. So for folks who are watching the YouTube video version, you might have to go back and forth between the two slides or have your PowerPoint pulled up at the same time. I realize that because I have object play on 2 different slides, the picture that is on the previous slide, it shows different levels but does not show the text that corresponds with it, so you might have to move back and forth. But we've already covered up until coordination of secondary circular reactions, which is on this page, and now we're going to be moving on to tertiary circular reactions. So like I mentioned, our coordination of secondary circular reactions, this is when children are able to now coordinate their repetitive actions and engage in more goal-directed, so looking for hidden objects. They're starting to develop more object permanence, and this is the beginning stages of that symbolic play. And then we see the tertiary, and feel free to peek back at the picture like I mentioned on the previous slide. It just gives you an image of what the tertiary with that small example. And this is from about 12 to 18 months. So our infants and toddlers are now starting to experiment with new behaviors and being a bit more creative in the way that they are using objects. So they now understand, okay, I know how this object works. Now what can I do with it? What is something that I can try out that I haven't tried out before? Getting a little bit more creative, testing out maybe some trial and error, becoming more complex with their play. So instead of just banging a cup, a child may scoop or pour using a cup with some water, or fill and dump using their cup. And they're thinking about bigger questions. So what happens if this, or what about if I do this? And they're making that shift from exploration to play, thinking about what do objects do in the exploration stage, and now they're moving past that and they're going into what can I do with the objects that are placed in front of me. So I'm not just banging the puzzle pieces, I'm actually starting to put the puzzle pieces onto the wooden board and using them with a creative lens. So I might be starting to group different textures of objects and then thinking in terms of what children are going to do from 18 to 24 months, we're calling this our mental combinations. So this is when children start to engage in problem solving, they're anticipating cause and effect, and they're engaging in functional play. So remember we talked about functional play a few weeks ago with our passive and active. So passive child is, carrying or mouthing a ball with not really any intentions, where our functionally active child is passing a ball back and forth with an adult, stacking rings onto the wooden pegs. So we're engaging in more problem solving skills. And we're going to, again, discuss in a little bit the role of the adult and how we can support problem solving and helping children to practice cause and effect. And now we're going to talk about dramatic play. Okay, so now we're going to talk about dramatic play. And remember, dramatic play is connected to a child's ability to represent objects. So at around 12 months to 18 months, we see children engaging in pre-pretense, the beginning stages of dramatic play, and self-pretend. So they're taking their personal experiences and repeating those actions. So they're putting a phone up to their ear and pretending to eat or sleep. And during this time, children do not use object substitution or sequencing. So they need the real life object in order to represent or pretend with it. So they're using a phone that looks like a phone, and they're using a baby doll that looks like a baby doll in order to have them pretend to eat, or using a real blanket if they're going to lay down and pretend to sleep. And there's no sequential order. So they're using singular actions on objects. So they might use a spoon to feed a baby and then be all done and walk away and go do something else. They're not engaging in repetitive and sequencing behaviors, whereas when we get to 18 to 24 months, we start to see that come forth more. So we're seeing the sequencing of events. So instead of just using a spoon to feed a baby, we are holding up the spoon, scooping it into the bowl, putting up to the baby's lips and feeding the baby. And then once the baby is all done, we take a wipey and wipe the baby's face with a burp cloth. And then we might burp the baby. So it's a sequence of events in that whole eating routine. Whereas our pre-pretense and self-pretend of the 12 to 18 month children, they're just starting out. So they're practicing their early stages of dramatic play skills, but they're not incorporating object substitution, sequencing, or other pretend. And we're going to see children 18 to 24 months being more purposeful and intentional in the way that they're pretending with objects. So again, actively making a phone call, "Hi, Mom," and then putting the phone down and maybe waiting for the response of an adult. Representing another object for a phone, so maybe they'll use a banana or a block instead, and they have a higher representation of objects. So their symbolic representation allows them to see that, okay, the banana or the block could be a phone instead of me having to actually grab the phone. And then around 24 months, we see children start to incorporate imagery, imaginary objects, and become more of an active agent. And remember, an active agent is when children are making objects come to life. So they're pretending that their toy dog can bark and drink water, or they're walking an imaginary dog while they're holding a string and pulling them. So I'm imagining, I'm being more creative in my thinking. I'm pretending that I have a baby doll who can cry. So we see the progression in just a short amount of time, in just 2 years, of the stages of dramatic play. And then next we're going to get into what social play looks like for infants and toddlers. Okay, so social play. And for this slide and the next slide, we're focusing primarily on parents and for peers. So this slide is going to first touch on parents, and then we'll get into peers. So let's revisit our thoughts on the adult role, because even though I'm talking primarily about parents, we also want to just think about caregivers and even teachers as well. So how does our role impact infants and toddlers' social play and their understanding of the world? And we know that social play involves the connection between adults and the infant and toddler. And the socialization of an infant and toddler into the world is important for their language development, for them to be able to build trust and have an emotional understanding for others around them, such as developing empathy. And adults, they can engage in social play with infants and toddlers through their day-to-day interactions. So during that diaper change, you're engaging in social play when you might be doing tickling or peekaboo. And your text mentions, and I think this is important to note, that infants and toddlers spend 50% of their day interacting with a caregiver in a childcare setting. And like I said, those day-to-day interactions are social play for that infant and toddler. And this is a large amount of their day spent engaging and interacting with a caregiver. And those first initial steps of their socialization into the world, those first few years of life, come from their interactions with adults. And we can see from a parental perspective that with parents, there's a little bit of a difference between mothers and fathers in their social play. And we see that mothers tend to be more of caregivers and fathers tend to be more of play partners. So mothers are primarily engaging in caregiving routines such as the eating and the feeding, and fathers tend to be more active play partners, so engaging in playing with materials and toys. And we see that mothers tend to be less physical and innovative and more child-directed, instructive and verbal, and fathers tend to be less instructive, more physical, directive, innovative, and tactile. And again, this is just based off of the study from your text. It may vary from cultural differences. Those impact the role of the parent as the play partner, and your text also describes a few examples of what cultural differences look like in the role of the mother and the role of the father, and in general the role of the parent as an active social play partner. And I want you to also take a peek at the video that I've put down here. Molly Wright, she's a young child, and she talks about how every child can thrive by 5, and it is a great quick video to just give you the idea that simple interactions are extremely meaningful. So remembering back to that 50% of interacting with a caregiver in a childcare setting, and it focuses really on the element of the game peekaboo and how peekaboo is a strong contender for brain development and early connection, socialization, language development. And we can really think about adults using a variety of different strategies to promote play and learning for infants and toddlers. So it's not just in being able to play peekaboo or being able to provide a variety of different materials. It's a lot of different things. So we can think about some ways to promote motor play for infants and toddlers in just the types of objects that we provide in close proximity. So are children able to reach and grasp and look at objects in their close proximity? If we have a child who's doing tummy time or laying on their back, can they look up and reach at the objects on the mobile? And do they have objects that are safe for them to bang or put in their mouth, both during mealtime and playtime and other routines? We see that the infant or toddler is engaging in social interactions and has the ability and options for both exploration and play. And we can think about, symbolic and language play, and how really those simple steps of talking, reading, and singing with a child are extremely important for language development, pre-literacy skills, symbolic play, and it also leads to social play with peers. And behaviors such as B.F. Skinner proposed that early language development is acquired through our imitation. And this resonated with me because we really do think and see in studies how our interactions with others allow us the ability to imitate. And children as young as 3 months old, they're starting to create vowel sounds, ooh, ah, imitating the vocalizations of adults. And even children who are deaf or hard of hearing, they're able to still form through signs. And talking, reading, and singing with our infants and toddlers is giving them the ability to practice and imitate language and understand social cues, build connections, build that trust, right? So that initial aspect of trust versus mistrust. And we see how it's extremely important to develop a strong and secure relationship built on trust in order to be able to be a caregiver who can be an active play partner and have an understanding, okay, those day-to-day interactions, that 50% of the day that I'm interacting, that's meaningful social play time with my infant or toddler. So like I said, check out that video so you can see how, a simple game of peekaboo can support brain development and early connections, and how connections are extremely key, and especially the interactions. And now we're going to be talking in the last slide about social play. I should have clarified. We're going to be talking about social play with peers. We're continuing our social play and thinking about it from a peer perspective, because we know that children are starting to develop play skills and they're going to start to hang out and be around others. And it really depends on the setting that they're in. And we see that there are big shifts in social play with peers now that we have experienced COVID, and depending on if an infant or toddler is surrounded by siblings or if they are in childcare, not every infant and toddler goes to childcare and hangs out with peers their age until around the preschool years. And you can see that through social play with peers, children are starting to develop the early cooperation skills and understanding the importance of learning about others and being in settings with others, and it can start to develop early turn taking. And we see that during the first year, it's primarily solitary and exploratory play. So children are playing alone or they're playing with an adult, which is perfectly normal. And children are primarily figuring out how their bodies work and how objects work. So again, back to that exploration of objects and exploratory play, and they start to then engage in goal-directed behaviors and may play simple games such as peekaboo or roll the ball back and forth. And then during the second year of play, it's becoming more connected to parallel and social associative. So we talked about our distinction between parallel and associative, so our social or interactive play. And remember, our parallel aware play is I am playing alone, but I know someone else is there and I'm aware of them, but I'm not playing with them yet. I'm not really interacting with them. They're there though. And through parallel play, I'm still playing alone, but we're playing the same thing now. We might be in the same area of the classroom, and we might be both playing with the blocks, and I might try to copy my peer or imitate their sound. So maybe we're both rolling cars down a ramp next to each other, and then I notice that my peer next to me starts to go vroom vroom, and so I start to go vroom vroom, and I'm imitating them. And then through associative play, I'm now starting to engage with another peer and developing play skills in order to start to have conversations and build friendships. So I'm building those early relationships around similar interests that we might have. So my emotional awareness of myself and others is starting to increase as my symbolic play becomes more prominent. And remember, adults can be facilitators too in social play for peers. So thinking about how we can help children to increase their socialization with others, and thinking about how we have a variety of different temperament differences between peers and how this might impact their ability to play next to one another or near one another. And another thing that I forgot to mention earlier is that not only interactions are key, but so are the play materials that adults provide. So having a variety of different materials to stimulate learning. So if you're thinking about the different types of materials that you might put out, this can also be a way to increase socialization with peers. So finding out what children are interested in and what are age appropriate materials. So maybe I have a mixed age classroom, or I have two siblings who are of different ages. So what materials could I put out to promote early connections between two peers and figure out what toys can help them to facilitate play And how am I going to help them to interact with one another based on the types of materials that I put out? So thinking, what are children going to learn or gain from using this toy or material? And how is it going to help them build awareness for their self or others? And we can think about different types of materials with the types or the textures. So do we have soft or hard materials, loud versus quiet materials? And of course, we always want to pay attention to having materials in the classrooms or in any setting with young infants and toddlers and children related to cultural and diversity elements. So we're going to touch more on materials and different stages of play in the next coming lectures, but that is all I have for you. That is all I have for you for our infant and toddler play. I hope you enjoyed, and I will talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.